afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to see all of you here for this discussion on Tibet. This is significant because we will be releasing a book on cultural genocide in Tibet, which is really a reflection on what is happening in Tibet today and the survival of an entire culture. I'd like to just say a couple of words before we start off. One is that in all of the reflections, sorry, can you hear me? Okay. In all of our reflections on Tibet in the last 10 to 15 days, I think the first one is a matter of concern to many people, and it may not actually, both are linked in one sense, because the present leadership in China has very little interest in the first issue. It has very few stakes in getting the Dalai Lama into Tibet, and it has even less stakes, I think, in preserving the culture of Tibet, because it has presented a challenge to the Chinese state. However, on the second issue, I think there are institutions, global institutions, that can be invoked. For example, the UNESCO's heritage declarations, cultural heritage declarations, and the number of declarations from the UNESCO from 1972 onwards, which have declared that world cultures should be protected. So in many ways, I think there's a glimmer of hope there. And as long as Tibetan culture can be protected through a series of applications to UNESCO and networking through these bodies, the issue of the cultural revival of Tibet, and therefore the political revival of Tibet as well, can be ensured. But having said that, I would really like to announce the book launch. And Si Kyong, His Honorable Si Kyong here will perhaps launch the book.
I think we'll do it together.
All together. Okay.
It's a unity launch.
All right, unity launch, as he says. We'll do that one. Shall we stand up and launch? We will start today's event by presentations from our very, very eminent panelists here. I'd like to introduce all of them at once, and then we can invite them to go up to the podium and make their presentations. Srimati Meenakshi Lekhi is not here right now, as she's involved somewhere else, and she will be here with us shortly. But as you know, she's a lawyer of the Supreme Court, and she's also a member of Parliament in the present Lok Sabha. She has also been a spokesman for the Bharatiya Janata Party. I think she doesn't need a great deal of introduction here. I think all of us are aware of her background. Ambassador Kamal Sibal, of course, again, he doesn't need a great deal of introduction. He's very well known. He's a spokesman on national TV, various programs on Indian foreign policy. But just briefly, he has been India's foreign secretary from July 2002 to November 2003. And he studied at St. Stephen's College and other prestigious institutions, been ambassador to Turkey, to Egypt, and to France. Mr. Jaidev Ranade, again, a very eminent face. I think everybody recognizes him. Has been a member, he's president of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy, and a former additional secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat, Government of India, was a member of the National Security Advisory Board. He is, of course, plugged into the entire think tank range in New Delhi, and has been eminent fellow at many of these think tanks. He is the author of the book China Unveiled, Insights into Chinese Strategic Thinking, and has recently published 2 new books, which he will also release shortly, I believe. I'm invited, right? Yes. Professor Ming Xia. Professor Ming Xia has studied at Fudan University in China, one of China's best-known universities. He received his PhD from Temple University, and he has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center, East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore, and he is the author of The Dual Development State and the People's Congresses and Governance in China, along with a host of other books. But the most important thing is, I think, to my mind, he was included in the top 100 Chinese public intellectuals of 2009 and 2010. Dr. Lobsang Sangay, I think, needs no introduction to this audience in particular. He, of course, is very much a Delhi boy because he went to Delhi University. And he was also elected as the youngest executive member of the Tibetan Youth Congress. And as a Fulbright scholar, he got his master's degree at LSD. Sorry, what?
SJD.
At SJD, sorry, yes, right.
That's a doctorate degree.
Yes, and he has won the election twice, a second time this time, to head the Tibetan administration in Dharamsala, and in a sense, I think been very honored to have been chosen as the Sikyong immediately after the first election by His Holiness himself. I'd like to invite Ambassador Kamal Sibal to make his presentation first.
Dr. Lobsang Sangay, Professor Palla, Mr. Ranade, Professor Ming Xia. I'm truly delighted and honored to be asked to speak on this occasion when we are, all of us are very concerned about the future of Tibet, Chinese policies in Tibet, and what we see is large-scale, systematic destruction of the foundations of Tibetan civilization. I read the report because it was sent to me before this event, and I should say it makes rather depressing reading because systematically the Chinese policies have been fashioned in such a way that they seek to achieve numerous objectives, the foremost being their thinking that if they destroy the basis of Tibetan civilization, then the Tibetan problem, from their point of view, can be better controlled. Separatism in Tibet can be controlled. The threat that His Holiness the Dalai Lama presents to them in Tibet, that can be countered. And the more the Tibetan people are pulled away or alienated from the roots of their own civilization, the more they can be sinicized. And what has happened in Manchuria or in Inner Mongolia could also be achieved in Tibet. When I was going through the book, I was quite enlightened in terms of issues that we have not really looked at seriously with regard to, for example, the UN Convention on Genocide, which says that any deliberate act intended to destroy the religion, language, or culture of a national or racial or religious group would amount to cultural genocide. And this would include things like trying to reform the language, reform in inverted commas, and the forceful removal of Tibetan nomads, and followed alongside with the population transfer from mainland China to Tibet, would be part of this systematic exercise to destroy the Tibetan traditional way of life, etc., etc. Now, we've been reading a lot of press reports from time to time about what is happening in terms of so-called development, economic development of Tibet, which includes massive influx of Chinese migrant workers. This new railway line that has been built will facilitate this. There is also, as the book points out, the interference in the Tulku system, the whole basis of transmission of knowledge from one generation to another through the process of reincarnation of lamas who sustain the spiritual lineage of the Tibetan people. That will be affected, and the disruption that has been caused in the Tibetan monasteries, the education system that is being interfered with, etc., etc. The book also recalls the 70,000 character petition of the Panchen Lama at that time, in 1962, where Chow En-lai is quoted as saying that religion in Tibet today has no future. We are also aware of the widespread protests in Tibet in 2008. Since 2009, 149 cases of Tibetans who have self-immolated have been recorded. The book actually tells you about the Tibetan culture, civilization in fact, and that they have their own architecture, their own medical system, their own astrology, methods of agriculture, animal husbandry, arts and language, literature, and there's a very rich spiritual tradition. The monastic education system is a process of continued renewal and transmission of Buddhist teachings, which has been interrupted since 1959. And the consequences of the policies that the Chinese government has followed in Tibet has resulted in social breakdown, lawlessness, disharmony, and pursuit of, how should I say, money, greed, and alcoholism, etc., etc. So as progressively the space is being shrunk for the Tibetans to learn their language, and through that remain linked to their cultural roots. The book also points out the forceful removal of Tibetan nomads from their land, and they are being put into housing colonies. Now all this really has led to the fact that the nomads who had a very good understanding of the knowledge of the Tibetans' fragile ecosystem, that has become, or becoming, useless. On top of that, there is large-scale mining and other infrastructure projects that have been undertaken, that are being undertaken by the Chinese government. I was quite surprised to read, or we had read these kind of reports in the past, but reading the book brought them freshly to your mind, is that the Communist Party of China thinks that the real Buddha for the Tibetans is the Communist Party of China. And this was, the Tibetan Party Secretary Zhang Qingli, I don't know if I pronounced his name rightly, he's the one who has used extremely vituperative vocabulary towards His Holiness. Now, the Chinese have been using this arm of tourism not only in Tibet, but in many parts of the world and where they have strategic interests. I was surprised to read that in a small place like Maldives, they have 700,000 Chinese tourists which visit the islands every year. And when it comes to pressuring countries who do not abide by the Chinese wishes at the political level, they begin to use tourism as an instrument of pressure. Now they are encouraging mass tourism from the mainland to Tibet. Now if it was a free country where people move to and fro on their own volition and had the curiosity to see various parts of the country, etc., I can understand that. But the manner in which the Chinese are undertaking this whole business of promotion of tourism is actually mind-boggling. They are saying that 23 million Chinese tourists will visit Tibet this year, which means 63,000 will arrive every day. And the goal is to raise this figure to 35 million in 2020. There are 6 trains that reach Lhasa every day. So the purpose behind this is to bind Tibet even more closely to China and marginalizing the Tibetan people and polluting the Tibetan environment. And expanding the railway lines and all-weather highways and air travel is making this possible. Whether these figures are absolutely correct or not, I don't know. But nevertheless, the scale is rather impressive. In fact, as the book says, that when the Chinese made the first railway line to Manchuria, and that changed the entire complexion of the Manchurian population. And the whole idea, as it happened in Manchuria, and Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang, would be to flood Tibet with Han Chinese. And once they come there in such large numbers, the idea would be to see how many of them can be incentivated to come and settle down in Tibetan territory. And then, of course, the book actually, quite frankly, visualizes, or rather says, that the Chinese are actually waiting for His Holiness to pass away and then impose the next Dalai Lama on the Tibetan people. In other words, the party will arrogate to itself to the right to recognize and appoint Tibetan spiritual masters. The party is also uprooting the Buddhist lineage tree by assaulting the concept of reincarnation, and understandably from the party's point of view, they don't believe in the concept of reincarnation, which would violate party ideology. The education system is being interfered with, as has been brought out very graphically, whereas the monasteries and the monastic education system has dominated Tibetan intellectual and spiritual life for centuries. Earlier on, there was a mention by Professor Balla about trying to hopefully protect Tibetan culture through UNESCO's identification of heritage areas or heritage sites. In fact, the book says that this has a potential danger, because China has already presented a proposal for declaring a part of the Tibetan Plateau as a heritage site, which would then mean that the nomads will have to be moved out of this area altogether. And this will become a no-go area for parts of the Tibetan population, which then will generate certain other problems, especially in terms of preserving the ecology of the region. In fact, the book points out, as part of Cultural Genocide, that 2.5 million Tibetan nomads have been removed from their pastoral lives. In addition to that, there's an imposition of language policies, a crackdown on Tibetan intellectuals, banning religious festivals and cultural activities, and a systematic effort to destroy Tibetan Buddhism. Controls like curbing the number of monks in monasteries, the so-called patriotic re-education, limiting the role of spiritual teachers, etc., is part of this policy. And the book says rather poignantly that as a result of all this, the Tibetans may remain biologically intact, but the collective Tibetan identity would irremediably suffer. There have been several UNGA resolutions which have asked for ensuring respect for the fundamental human rights of the Tibetan people and their distinctive cultural and religious life, beginning with the UNGA resolution of 1959, then in 1961, then the third resolution was in 1965. In 1991, the UN Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minority Rights again pronounced on the subject. In 1997, the International Commission of Jurists noted the escalation of repression in Tibet, the re-education campaign in monasteries, arrests of leading religious figures, population transfers, erosion of Tibetan language, degradation of Tibet's environment. Interestingly, the book points out that Buddhist Tibet's destruction at the hands of communist China does not necessarily lie in either the Chinese people or their culture. After all, they absorbed Buddhism from outside, and it has become a very important part of China's own civilization and culture. But interestingly, the book points out that it is in the intolerance of China having imported in the form of communism from the West, that this intolerance actually is a product of Marxist China, the Communist Party of China, which is motivated by this Marxist ideology. And the Tibetan culture is seen, and identity is seen, as a fundamental challenge to party rule in Tibet. I went to Dharamsala a few months ago, and I visited the museum and saw the damage that was done to Tibetan historical sites and monasteries during the Cultural Revolution in 1966. The Jokhang was turned into a pigsty. 6,000 monasteries were destroyed by 1976. And literally millions of priceless manuscripts were burnt, and High Lamas and monks were jailed or forced into labor camps or killed. As I mentioned, there is an attempt to reform the Tibetan language, and there is concern that the Tibetans would become hybridized because they'll be uprooted from their own cultural origin. What is also happening is this forceful relocation of the nomads is resulting in a lot of these Tibetan herders slaughtering their livestock and moving into new building housing colonies and abandoning their traditional way of life. Apparently, over 700,000 nomads have been relocated, resettled since 2000. Now, the use of the Tibetan language is being excluded from administrative spheres, and it's being reduced to a status where it would become redundant beyond culture and literacy spheres. And therefore, the space for the Tibetan language is being shrunk. The idea is to give the image to the Tibetan language as a, inverted commas, useless language for the purpose of seeking employment, etc., etc. Now, there is also a bit of a method behind all this, because China's urbanization of Tibet is also a way to solve the problem of China's slowing economy. The whole idea would be to create a market for China's excess capacities, etc., etc., and shift the population increasingly into the Tibetan area. Now, just a few comments of a general kind. That, you know, this modernization and change in Tibet could be justified if there was a representative, democratically elected government in Beijing, which acted in accordance with the policies that have been discussed at various levels and have popular support. In itself, modernization and change may not be wrong, but when it is imposed from the outside on what is not an autonomous territory in reality, but a militarily occupied territory, then the picture becomes different. And the Chinese aim is to exploit the resources of Tibet, amalgamate Tibet into Han civilization as much as possible, deal with the separatism, also bring about demographic change. And the idea is that economic growth and development will promote integration, etc., etc. And there is also, of course, geopolitical factors such as relations with India. Now, China has done social and cultural hegemony engineering in mainland China, and this they are repeating in Tibet and imposing it on them. We've seen how China has created infrastructure, huge infrastructure, just take 2 minutes, huge infrastructure even when on the face of it, it is not economically needed. The Belt and Road Initiative is a good example of this. This also explains the frenetic pace in which infrastructure is being built in Tibet. The logic is the same. And the way China has destroyed its own environment, and we are all aware of this, so you can imagine what they will do and are doing to the environment in Tibet. They destroyed the huge legacy of Chinese civilization during the Cultural Revolution. Now, with that mindset, you can imagine that they do not have much respect or attach that much value and have a sense of commitment to preserving the Tibetan culture. And when a government does not accept dissent, there is no scope for dissent in the polity, then it becomes very difficult for the public in Tibet or elsewhere to be able to force the government to change its policies. You see the contrast with India. I mean, we have a lot of problems internally, but we don't try and solve those problems through demographic change or interference in religious practices or destruction of religious sites. We, in fact, promote regional languages and cultures. We help them to encourage them to flourish, and we have a whole body of very active environmental activists. And finally, I would say that China is getting away with it. There is no international pressure on China. Lots of humanitarian causes are taken up by the West, but what China is doing in Tibet is ignored. Even when China was weak, there was no pressure on China. But now that China is so strong and is now slated to be the world's number 2 power and has the ambition to be number 1. The stakes that the rest of the world has in China and its economy is such that they're not going to jeopardize their self-interest by raising the very legitimate case of the suppression of the Tibetan cultural identity. Even in the South China Sea, we've seen how the Americans and the others and the ASEAN countries have accepted the realities on the ground, and China has got away. We also see the reluctance of Western leaders to officially meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is surprising because he really is the embodiment of peace. Nobody raises these issues in the UN Human Rights Council or in the UN. So we have a tragedy that is unfolding itself before our eyes, involving a peace-loving, non-violent people with a rich and unique cultural tradition. I'm only happy that we are playing whatever role we can play in helping the survival of Tibetan culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was really set the ball rolling on this discussion. Mr. Jaidev Ranade, next, please. We have 20 minutes for each speaker. May I remind the speakers? Thank you.
Good afternoon. And to the younger, shall I say, elements of the audience, Tashi Delek. We've just heard from Ambassador Sibyl as to what's been happening in China, what the Chinese communists began doing when they came in. So what I will do is I'll fast forward to a more recent period and look at what exactly the Chinese are concerned with, what is their agenda as far as Tibet is concerned. And to my mind, there are 3 things that they are really focused on. The first is the Dalai Lama, how to undermine his influence, how to undercut his political standing and stature. The second is how to subordinate, or if I may say control, the Tibetan people inside Tibet, inside China. And there they have identified the monks and nuns as quote-unquote the troublemakers, so how they are proceeding on that. And the third is what are the prospects that we see at this time when change is afoot inside China and generally all around. So this is the way I'm going to look at it. But let me first start off by saying that in the Tibet Autonomous Region, and as far as China's policy towards Tibet is concerned, there is a complex bureaucracy that has evolved over the years. And it is that bureaucracy that actually is setting the agenda locally, internally in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And over the years it's grown. It's grown in the sense there are a large number of ethnic Tibetans who have been co-opted into the system inside the Tibet Autonomous Region. And here we see the first display of how the Chinese authorities are trying to whittle down the cultural underpinnings of the Tibetan people by insisting that Chinese should be the language for the test which would give them a job. So they have to pass a test and they have to do it in Chinese before they get a job. And there are over now 230,000 ethnic Tibetans who are as cadres, employed as cadres or otherwise members of the TAR government, Tibet Autonomous Region government, and the party in Tibet. So that's a large number. It exceeds the number of Tibetans who are here with us in India, and in fact probably combined Tibetans who are abroad. So that's a large number who are going to constitute one form of resistance, not to the idea of the Dalai Lama coming back, but to the idea that the Tibetans, if they return, then they will deprive them of their jobs or there will be a contest for the jobs. So that is one thing that the Chinese have been trying to create over time. The second is, I would call, to use a modern terminology, a kind of a securitization of Tibet that is taking place. We've been seeing over the years the construction of railway lines in Tibet and roadways. in the Tibet Autonomous Region, the directives are very clear that every civil construction, particularly of transportation networks, is authorized or is approved by the People's Liberation Army. Unless that approval is given, the project doesn't go through. And obviously, therefore, there is a dual purpose, a dual use for all these projects. So whereas they are touted as to enhance tourism, they are also there for building up the military capability of the Chinese inside Tibet. And I'll mention two examples to you. One is the renovation of the airport at Lhasa, at the Konka base, which was done to increase the number of tourists coming to Lhasa, almost double the number. But actually we saw that they are being used also for the rotation of troops when they come in. And that rotation is now being done largely by air. The second is in a smaller location, but picturesque location nevertheless, called Ningchir, which is just across us in Arunachal, where again, after the airfield was built, all the troop rotations there are being done by air. Supplies are also being brought in by air. Now that, of course, shortens the time available, or shortens the time that is taken by the Chinese military to bring their replenishments in and to bring their troops in. For us, that has a consequence. But how did they start focusing on, as I said, their main target, which is the Dalai Lama? They wanted to undermine his influence and undercut his international standing. In fact, they really began targeting the Dalai Lama once he began traveling abroad. That was from the very early 80s, actually end of 79, with his first trip. But as he traveled abroad, he gained an international stature, and I don't think I'll be wrong if I say that today, if we mention Buddhism, it's the face of the Dalai Lama that one imagines, or if you say the Dalai Lama, it's Buddhism that one imagines. Though there are other forms. There is, of course, as we all know, the Hinayana, Mahayana, etc. But the Dalai Lama is the one who is today imprinted on the people's minds, and he has got today a tremendous international stature. Considering that he came into India in 59 with not a shirt on his back, literally, and to come to this level, I think is something that is galling to the Chinese, and they have been trying to undermine his position. As China became stronger, militarily and economically, they began applying pressure on the West. And I would put the date as 2007, 2008, under Hu Jintao. That was when, after the global economic downturn, China felt its day has come, and they began applying pressure on Western countries not to give any official reception to the Dalai Lama, not to receive him officially, or to entertain him at high levels in their respective countries. Failure to comply with Chinese requests meant a punitive measure followed, and that usually was a drop in FDIs or a suspension of trade, and certainly suspension of all diplomatic and governmental contacts for a period ranging from 8 months to almost 3 years. Many countries decided it was not worth it, and they just stopped receiving him. We noticed, I think it was 2 years ago, President Obama also at the annual breakfast meeting, he did not meet the Dalai Lama, but it was a greeting exchange from far away. That was the extent of the Chinese pressure that was being felt all across. This was backed up with an effort to undercut his influence within the Tibetan Buddhist community. And there, what the Chinese began doing was using two levers that they had. One was trying to create divisions between the various sects and inside particularly the Tibetan communities abroad. The second was to try and use as enticement the facility to refurbish their original monasteries inside Tibet, and they would tell the Tibetan sects, the leaders of the various sects, that if there was a willingness to compromise or if there was a willingness to engage with the Chinese Communist Party, then the monasteries could be refurbished or renovated, and very often the Chinese authorities themselves extended financial support for such work. There were, of course, other moves, including in Lumbini, where they literally bargained. They got the tourism minister of Nepal to say that the Dalai Lama is not welcome in Lumbini till such time as he has an agreement with the Chinese on Chinese terms. They have allowed a couple of sects to come in and have their annual festivals in Lumbini, but obviously there is some kind of a compromise that has taken place on that. At least that's my estimation. The other thing that is happening inside Tibet is the augmentation of a security infrastructure in Tibet. Since 2014, the internal security budget of China has increased and surpassed the national defense budget. And we see exponential increase in the security budget, the public security budget in Xinjiang and Tibet since that time. And in 2015, Tibet's public security budget was $1.02 billion, which is a large figure given the population that exists there, and that has gone up by 54% last year. So you can imagine the kind of expenditure that they put in, they invest in the security in Tibet. When Chen Kuang-o was the party secretary of Tibet, he followed, of course, Changqing Li, who was referred to earlier, a very strong person. And when Chen Kuang-o came in, he focused on initially economic betterment of the Tibetan people, and secondly on restrictive security policies being brought in. And he introduced two things that we are all aware of. One is the iron grid system, which entailed a response time of under 2 minutes by the public security authorities to any incident taking place anywhere in the Tibet Autonomous Region. The second was the Skynet, whereby all electronic conversations were monitored. And so whether it was email, whether it was telephones, anything, they were all under the grid, and they were all being monitored by these people. So that is what began happening, and then he introduced a third step. After this, it was expansion of party surveillance in Tibet, and he considered that that was the key to dominate the Tibetan people. And since 2011, 21,000 party cadres were sent out by 2016 across Tibet to all the 5,453 villages, and most recently it was decided, in fact just before he left and as Wu Ying-chie, the new party secretary, took over, it was decided to position one party cadre in every village with the task of recruiting one villager into the party each year. So that was the way in which they began working to try and establish the party dominance and party surveillance across Tibet. The third thing that the Chinese authorities began doing at the same time was to pump in, of course, a lot of military personnel, but they found a problem. The People's Armed Police authorities who were posted there, the People's Liberation Army who was posted there, were undergoing a lot of trauma, and so they had to be lured into serving their terms there. In fact, the latest recruits into the PLA are being given 5,000 yuan as bonus to serve in Xinjiang and Tibet. I find that the chairman has sort of just told me that I have very little time left. Let me conclude by making two quick points. We have the 19th Party Congress coming up on the 18th of October. It starts. There is a lot of expectation that things may change thereafter that. There are two things that I'm sure will happen. One, Xi Jinping will emerge much stronger. Second, some of the known hardliners, yet like Yu Changshan, who is the head of the CPPCC, which looks after minorities and Tibetans, and people like Chang Ching Li and Chu Wei-chun will retire. But does that mean that there will be a change in the policy towards Tibet? My own assessment is that that is extremely unlikely. As I have mentioned to you, there are many factors involved in crafting of China policy, and it's not just the party general secretary who will be able to have his writ run right across. So I expect that there will be continued controls on Tibet. There might be some flexibility shown in terms of a willingness, perhaps, to reopen negotiations with the Dalai Lama. And that an overture was made earlier when a senior member of the Central Party School faculty, Chin Wei, she wrote a lengthy piece in a Hong Kong paper saying that under no circumstances should China allow a situation of two Dalai Lamas to emerge like it has of two Panchen Lamas. So I think that will be their objective when they try and move for any negotiations, if at all. But otherwise, I don't think there is likely to be any relaxation or loosening of controls on Tibet. Finally, let me just say that I recall an autobiography written by an American missionary who had traveled to Tibet. He served there many years, and this was in the early 1900s. And at the time he left, he said that there were 4.5 Christians in Tibet. He had been able to convert. He was a missionary, mind you. He was a doctor. He thought he'd have a lot of success. He said there were 4.5, and he describes them as himself, his wife, his daughter, that's 3, his groom, that was 4, and he says half is because there was a warlord in Batang who used to, whenever he met him, say, yes, yes, I'm a Christian. He said, but I don't know whether he said that to keep me happy or not. But that, I say that only to point out that is the resilience of the Tibetan spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaidev. I think we make all our comments at the end of the thing because we like to have the speakers in first. So Ms. Lekhi has said she would like to speak a little bit later since she's just come in. So Professor Shia, Ranshia. She would like to speak a bit later, so why don't you? Yeah. Yeah.
It is great to be with so many great scholars and politicians, and I'm going to say a few things about this current situation in China and also in Tibet. Because the assignment to me was about China, the 19th Party Congress, and also Sino-Tibet relationship, and also Sino-Indian relationship. So that's a big topic. So I have to be cursory in order to keep my talk within 20 minutes. We have heard a lot of talk about the rise in China and also the strength of the Chinese current economy and military might. But I want to remind everyone, and I think in China, especially Xi Jinping, and he has been infected by a syndrome, I call it Alice eating mushroom syndrome. So if we have read the book Alice in Wonderland, we know when Alice and he ate the mushroom, and so when the magic power was in her body, and so her ego was inflated, so she became more and more aggressive and to talk to the queen. But she kept doing that without being aware that the magic power actually start to decline. And so this is why there was a problem. And I think in China the same situation is going on. Because Xi Jinping, of course, and the Chinese leaders, they are talking in a very aggressive way and to the global community. But actually I think, and they have not realized the magic of the mushroom, and they had eaten, and for the past 30 plus decades actually has, 3 decades, actually has disappeared. But now their perception is behind this magic power. Why I say that? Because I want to say China actually has a big problem, so my central message is China, what went wrong? And so I want to say China got into a big turning point, that was in the year 2008. And since 2008 until today, I think China has been on the decline in many ways. And because China is being troubled by many crises. But all the crises, if someday China is going to have an implosion, and if China is going to be bugged by many internal crises, and I think all the seeds and all the apples of discord we can find in the year 2008. And since most of you are China specialists and are knowledgeable people, so I'm not going to get into details. I'm just going to go through the list. First is in the year 2008, the first thing happened is snow disaster. It paralyzed the entire Chinese transportation system during the Spring Festival peak time. So that was the first thing. Second thing was a Tibetan uprising in March. And so this is ethnic conflict. The third is a Sichuan earthquake and a big natural disaster and hit Sichuan, and it also costed the Chinese government tremendous amount of money. Then the fourth thing is the Beijing Olympics. And you can find China and spent a huge amount of money, actually more than all the previous modern Olympic games combined. Then the fifth thing is melamine poisoned powder milk. And you know actually before the Olympic game, and of course because the scandal was suppressed, so after the Olympic game, the scandal was revealed. And so thousands and thousands of Chinese young children, babies, and they drank the poisoned powder milk and became sick, especially caused kidney failure. And then in the year, in September, in the year of 2008, the Lehman Brothers collapsed, and so the financial tsunami actually broke out in Wall Street and also spread to the world. And then we saw in October, Bo Xilai, the left-wing leader, he was appointed into the, actually he went to the office, took office in November, and so he became the we can say the standard bearer, right, for new left-wing movement. And so this is how he started the division between the Chinese left-wing camp and the right-wing camp. And then we can find in that year, Liu Xiaobo in November, and he started the so-called Charter 08 movement. So this is the Chinese new effort and to try to democratize China. So this is the liberals, and they try to do something. So if we look at this whole year, 2008, we can find natural calamity, and we can find wasteful projects, and we can find people's welfare was sacrificed. We can find economic crisis. We can find political crisis, including left-wing political challenge and also liberal political challenge. I think if we look at all these series of conflicts and the crisis for the Chinese communist system, we can find from the year 2008 all the way until today, and we can find they are repeating. So I think this is really a big issue. The Chinese system is experiencing internal crisis. And so when we talk about China went wrong, and I have to talk about the major issue is economy. So we have to keep in mind the slogan, right? The very famous words from Bill Clinton, stupid, it is economy. So what's going on in China's today's economy? And China's economic growth rate has been on the skid for the past almost 6 years. So we can find they reached the peak in the year 2013, and so then 2011. Then all the way they started to decline, and since 2013, from 9% to 8% to 7%, now to 6%. And also this economic decline I don't think it's cyclical. It is more structural. So that's why we can either expect the long-term stagnation or maybe further decline. And also trade and also has declined. And one important issue is production and has been affected. One important reason is because global production chains, they have changed, and for two important reasons. One is because of the reindustrialization in the West, including in the United States. And another is, and many multinational corporations, they have moved their production out of China into countries such as India and Indonesia and Vietnam. And then also, China is experiencing a big change, that's demographic change. And so China has already exhausted its demographic dividend. And so if we compare China to India, you can find, and India is much, much more dynamic and full of its energy than today's China. And because of all these things, I cannot get into detail. So in China, many economists, they have talked about stagflation. Not only stagnation has happened, but also inflation has become a big issue. Because one important thing is when we look at inflation, one big issue is about M2 over GDP. And M2 over GDP, this ratio, China has the second highest ratio in the world, and only second to Lebanon. So imagine that China, as the second largest economy, its M2 over GDP is more than 200%. And but India is only about, to say, 50-some%. And even England is more than 100-some%. So China is dealing with the crazy renminbi, and they have put tremendous money into the economy. And also, if we think about Xi Jinping, and he has got into big crisis because of his failure in economy. And I just want to mention to you three signature cases and which indicate Xi Jinping's incompetence and his failure in dealing with the Chinese economy. The first is, and we talk about the year 2015, the stock market crash. The stock market became crazy, and because of Xi Jinping, and he gave the pep talks, and he said, and not only at that moment, the Chinese stock market was reaching 5,000 and moving toward 6,000. Then he said, actually, it's going to go to 8,000, even it's going to get to 10,000. And so they saw many Chinese, and they thought they would have a guaranteed market, and so this is why the market became very speculative. But in the middle of the year, so at the end of July, June and early July, and Chinese stock market lost almost 30% of the volume. So that means more than 20 trillion Chinese yuan, they evaporated. But how did Xi Jinping deal with that? And on the one hand, and he basically suspended trading, and he destroyed the market. On the other hand, and he started arresting people, including the traders, and also sent the Deputy Minister of Public Security to be stationed in the China Securities Commission. So this is how, and he also suspended the rule of law. The second example is Xi Jinping proposed the so-called two birds policy in economy. Two birds, one bird is, and we are going to attract new birds, and if we have changed our cage. But the problem is the Chinese economy, they have thrown out a lot of migrant workers. They want to upgrade the economy to the high-end production. But unfortunately, their migrant workers, they were not prepared and with education or with upgraded skill and to really go to the high-end production. And so then the second policy she talked about is we are going to create the rebirth of Phoenix and in China. It means, and he wanted to really see the Chinese economic crisis after 2007 and would create a new opportunity for China to have a rebirth. But actually, it has not happened. And then the last example is Xi Jinping initiated One Belt, One Road policy. And One Belt, One Road policy, it is very costly, and Xi at this moment, and he has promised somewhere about, say, 7 to 8 trillion US dollars and for this project in the coming 10 years. And it has reached 64 countries. But one big problem is actually from its starting point, and it cannot overcome geopolitical crisis. And because the One Belt, the starting point is from Xinjiang, but Xinjiang is in ethnic crisis, and actually Xinjiang is under de facto martial law. So this is why it's a big issue. And then the One Road starting point point is from Fujian. And because of cross-strait crisis with Taiwan, so even the one road strategy and is going to deal with the potential crisis, especially, and we know many countries and are very lukewarm towards this initiative, including India. And of course, US and Japan, they are not very enthusiastic. So this is why I think Xi Jinping has not shown us and his leadership in the economy. So if we look at all of these things, we can see China is entering into a mid-income trap. And so what does that mean? And it means especially what are the ramifications for China's policy toward Tibet and toward India. And so for Tibetan policy, and I don't think the Chinese government is going to have ambitious initiative. They're going to keep the current status quo. They're going to emphasize stability, unity, and in order to strengthen its own legitimacy, regime legitimacy. So I don't think China is going to have many initiatives. And one important thing is because Tibet is not a single issue for the Chinese government to deal with. Because Tibet, we have to put the issue into a multi-ethnic empire context. Because China has to deal with Xinjiang, Mongolia, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and in the context. So this is why, at this moment, for the Chinese government, Tibet absolutely is not more important than other regions I have mentioned. And second, and if we look at the Chinese government, what they are doing toward Tibet, basically is a carrot plus a stick. Carrot in terms of throw money and the issue, and the stick in terms of very repressive military strategy. So I think they are going to keep doing that. And one important thing the Chinese government is doing is to emphasize the propaganda war. And so the Chinese government tries to use the propaganda machine and to have global reach and to control the discourse over Tibet. And then with regard to India, I want to quickly say a few things here about India. And because for India, and India is not the top priority country for China either. And of course, for some hawkish leaders, one leader, his name is Liu Yazhou, and the political commissar for Chinese National University, National Defense University, and he once said, and in the debate between maritime strategy or continental strategy, and between Mahan and Mackinder, and Liu Yazhou, he proposed, and we should understand, and the highland in Central Asia, they are the most important strategic spot we should conquer. And so in order to do that, and Liu Yazhou proposed, and China should take on India, and because India and is the weakest link in the Western containment against China. So this is one strategic thinking. But I don't think China is going to really take India as the #1 target. Because for the Chinese, and there are several hotspots we can see, and from North Korea and to Diaoyu or Senkaku Island, or to Taiwan Strait, and to South China Sea, and even to Burma, and we have border disputes there. And then if we look at India, and so I think, and if we have all the hotspots there, and the Chinese government is going to prioritize, I don't think India is going to be the #1 priority. And so because of all these things, what I want to suggest to India is, because for India, on the one hand, India has to be aware the importance of US and Japan, because India as a democracy, and I think the long-term support should come from the democratic world. But one important thing is, because Putin is played and the very important role of balancer, and balanced power game. And even Russia has only, the GDP is only half of the California, and the Russian government revenue and is only actually smaller than Walmart, but Putin is punching above his weight, and so he is creating troubles and manipulating a lot of countries and a lot of internal politics, including my country, US, right? And the world's messed up by Putin. And so this is how I think, and in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and India is an observer, and also India has maintained a long-term friendship with Russia. So I think, and for India, and Putin and Russia is a great asset and to take advantage of, and therefore can assure Indians' long-term national security. So what I want to say, let me conclude. I think for all of us, when we think about the issue of Tibet and India, and we have to pay attention to the internal dynamics of Chinese politics and Chinese economy. And therefore, I believe what's going on in China is actually breeding a long-term development that is the prospect of China's democratization. And so I believe many things are going to be intertwined with a huge historical movement that is the democratization of China, which I believe is going to happen in the coming 1 to 2 decades. And so, in addition to this prospect for China's democratization, I have other 3 Ps and for people who are concerned about India and Tibet. One is patience, and I really think that China is so huge, and it's very difficult for one single country to defeat China. But China is a huge giant, tend to lurch, and sometimes lurch right, lurch left, lurch forward, lurch back. And I'm thinking China as a lurching giant. I am afraid it's going to lurching back. Actually, China is lurching back. And so this is why I think if India is patient, and if Tibetans are patient, and we can say, and China, this big giant, this lurching giant, is going to be troubled by itself. And then the second is, I think, the preparation. And only when history delivers, and if we are prepared, and we can take advantage of a historic moment, and we can say that today's Tibetan situation is not single-handedly created by the Chinese. And many people, many countries, and put ingredients in the soup, and including India, including the British and the Americans. And so this is how I think if Tibetans are going to be ready, prepared, and I think history is going to deliver some surprises. And then last P, and I think for all of us, when we are thinking about India, Tibet, and China, and I think we should go back to Pan-Asianism. And I think we cannot go into ethno-nationalism. And if we are going to, invoke the purity of our blood for Tibetans, or for the Chinese, or for the Indians, and unfortunately you can find the ethno-nationalism has been running high in many places, including India and China, and including in the Tibetan community. I'm afraid that would be a really disastrous direction to go. So I think the Pan-Asianism, as proposed by Pandit Nehru more than half a century ago, I think maybe this is something for us to contemplate. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Shea. We will now have Ms. Lekhi, who has to go away in a little while, but we have her here nevertheless for the next 20 minutes. Please.
Well, amongst the professors who are experts on Tibet, a politician has to speak the political language. And the professors here, Mr. Sibyl and Mr. Ranade here, I think what I can outrightly say is the political strategy forward. I'll not go into the history, because most people here are aware of the history from dynastic rule to imperialist policies which have been followed till now. But what is the way forward? So whenever we make strategies for anything, as politicians, we always do SWOT analysis. We look at the positives and we look at the negatives. So the positives are that we have a very resilient population. People who we represent as Tibetans are resilient, are people who are firm in their belief. If they were not firm in their belief, I think 4 or 5 generations have gone past, people would have changed, but they haven't. The fact, from the time of invasion till now, people's core remains the same. So that's a positive. So you don't have to really train people in their thinking. You don't have to really teach them what the history is and how independent minds think. So they believe in their independence, no matter which part of the world they live in, and also understand the fact that policy of Indians towards them has remained constant by and large. People, the politicians in terms of government may have changed, but the attitudes towards Tibetan brothers and sisters has virtually been identical. There has not been much change. Nobody's ever said, get them out of the country, or no such movement ever has started. So these are people who have maintained their identity, yet have assimilated with the Indian system. So there's a great amount of affiliation without being part of the system. So that's a positive. That means they are still seeking for their own country. And so far as India is concerned, we recognize Tibet not as part of China. We know that Tibet was a separate region. So that these are positives. What are the negatives? Negatives are that whenever Dalai Lamaji is traveling across the world, for us he's head of a state, and he's been accorded the same protocol as any head of state. In fact, the Indian missions, unlike most other countries, go out of the way to appoint officers with him in his duty, do whatever is necessary from the diplomatic perspective, according the status and according the same hierarchy, and maybe more. Personally also, people look at him as a spiritual leader who belongs to all of us. So these are all positives. The negatives, however, are which unfortunately I think even Tibetan people have not recognized, and unfortunately I happen to be speaking about it. The negatives are that people who are supposed to be decision makers, like Indian stand, everybody knows. Asian stand, more or less, we all know. But what is the Western stand? They continue to deal with China the way any good businessman deals with another country. That is where we need to work at. In terms of strategy, that is the area you need to work deeply on. So they will be kind. Some Hollywood actors would join the procession, would come and be at Dharamshala, talk all the good things. But when it comes to dealing with China, as a nation in South China Sea, what is the strategy they are working on? Answer is no work. On the ground, there is no work. So if we have to deal with China, we have to tell the world that China, end of the day, is a South China Sea, geographically on that side of the world. If they make CPC or proceed on this side, they are getting into the Indian Ocean. So again, taking control of Tibet, getting into POK, furthering their influence on the region. So that is how the global imperialists would work: increase their geography, increase their influence, increase their economy. And unfortunate part is the people who are supposed to control all these things are part of increasing Chinese economy. Of course, Mr. Ranade in his address stated that we do not know how well the Chinese economy is working, and there are some signs of slipping, and so did the professor say the same thing. I would say nobody really knows what is Chinese economy. Nobody even knows how to value yuan. What is the real value? Nobody really has the intrinsic knowledge because the borders are closed. Now, if there is a country whose borders and access to information is closed, how is it the world is dealing with that economy and helping it progress? Unfortunately, we are not questioning the right questions, and we are not questioning the right people. Our focus has been very dispersed. I think the focus has to shift, and the focus has to be focused on people who are influencers of this decision-making process. India's influence is limited to the extent that Tibetans, we are hosts for Tibetans. We have been their hosts for many, many, many years. We continue to give the same support. We continue to stand by Dalai Lamaji in terms of respect, spirituality, understanding, and even political support. We are there. But have we been able to shift the focus the way focus should have been shifted from less from India but more from China? Who are the people who can influence China? Only those who control their economy can influence China. And they are the ones who would be sending celebrities but on ground do nothing. I think the hard questions need to be asked. That how, under these circumstances, you're going to deal with China on the economic front. What is the trade deficit? How much of trading is happening? How much of money is getting invested? And if you stand by the principles of genocide, how is it that you're still pumping money into that economy? Those are the hard facts and hard questions which we need to work strategically. And I think in our entire discourse of more than 50, 70 years, we've missed out the right questions. So I think the right questions need to be asked, because if we go by the economic understanding, so far as India is concerned, after our war with China, virtually we had nothing to do with China till about 80s. Governments changed, a different government came in between. This was Janata Party government, and before that Congress. So as long as 84, there was really not much trucking with China. In 84, Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and 84 December, if I'm not mistaken, the then Prime Minister of India made a visit to Thailand, and that was the first interaction between head of state between India and China. So December, this happens, and I think by February, March, India gives the most favored nation status to China. And it is from this point, the economy of China started changing and the economy of India started changing. If you look at the parameters of those times, we were ahead in communication technology, we were ahead in science and technology, we were ahead on health parameters, we were ahead even on education. Post that, there's been a steep decline of the Indian economy, and the Chinese economy started booming, and post that, all the parameters shifted differently, and the largest trade deficit happened between the two countries. So is the case globally. So this was the time when there was a boom in Chinese economy. And with all that boom, I remember the kind of questions India faced with respect to export of garments and things worldwide. But no such questions are asked when it is Chinese production. No hunger mapping comes, no labor law disputes happen, minimum wages is not questioned, and people are constantly buying Chinese goods because it suits everybody. And so many polluting industries which were taken out of other countries have been shifted to China, and no questions asked. So I think that's where the strategy has to be. And this is coming strictly from a political perspective. Academicians will do their work in terms of research, data, and details. And as a person, if given a problem, my head starts working how to resolve the problem and what is the SWOT analysis and how we have to go forward. This, in my assessment, is the way forward. Because until and unless we hit the right target, we will be knocking the wrong doors. So up till now, I feel as in terms of strategy, we've been knocking the wrong doors. We have to knock the right doors, and we have to ask the right questions. That on one side you support the case of genocide. Do you or do you not support the case of genocide? Let's ask that question first. And if you do, what is your stand on Chinese economy? How are the investments being made? Who's supporting all this? Where are the polluting industry? What is the minimum wage? What kind of slavery laws operate? We don't ask those questions. but we target a friendly country like India. So strictly from a hardcore Indian, a patriotic Indian, I would say these are the ways forward, which I would expect everyone to explore. I have a meeting with Urban Development Ministry. I need to recuse myself from the further discussion, but always available on this issue. I know my friends, my Tibetan friends know that I'm there, and I carry an inheritance which is pro-Tibet. Need to take it forward. Thank you very much. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.
Thank you, Ms. Lekhi. You're on your way out now. But we have our last speaker for the day, and perhaps our most important speaker for the day, the Honorable Lobsang Sangay. Please.
Difficulty of being the last speaker is everything that needs to be said is said, and there's nothing left. So either I can just conclude by saying I agree with everything that's been said and sit down, or I have to repeat everything that's being said. Then I'll take 1 whole hour. Let me start with thanking the panelists, Jay and Madhu and Ambassador Sibyl and Mingxia for lending their voice to the cause of Tibet. In fact, we are meeting the second time. We have friends who were there at the 550 conference in Dharamsala, which went quite well. But we, in a way, applied the Chatham House rules. You know, a good thing. Now we can say the same thing here, so because no one has heard what we said at the 550 conference. Now, let me begin by, essentially summarizing what Ambassador Sibyl talked about, the cultural genocide in Tibet, because I'm supposed to make the case. It was made very substantively, but what we are saying is cultural genocide is taking place in Tibet even now. That's the case. Now, the term genocide, I think geno in Greek meant race or tribe, and side means killing, the killing of race or tribe. Hence, Raphael Lemkin, who was a Holocaust survival and international law expert, defined genocide in some ways a systematic approach whereby a culture or a nation is destroyed from various angles. And then the UN Convention of the Crime of Genocide also defined in a similar way. So is this taking place? The Tibetan culture is being, annihilated or not? Is being destroyed or not? Is the question. And I think the answer is straightforward. Because in this book, the two parts. First part is how the Tibetan Buddhism came into Tibet. That's from India. And the second part is how it was destroyed. Now this, even though Ambassador Sibyl, others made this point, but it's very important to remember, late Panchen Lama submitted a report to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, in which he clearly listed, and with evidence, that 98% of monasteries and nunneries were destroyed, 99.9% of monks and nuns were disrobed. Now, why I say this is important is the report was compiled and submitted in 1962. Because some people say, oh, during Cultural Revolution, a lot of culture and cultural institutions of China were also destroyed. Hence, it's nothing unique or different when it comes to Tibet. But no, Tibet is unique and different because Cultural Revolution started in 1965. But 98% of monasteries and nunneries in Tibet were already destroyed by 1962. Not only the report was compiled in Tibetan language, Panchen Rinpoche traveled all over Tibet, and translated in Chinese and submitted to Chinese leaders. Hence, Mao Zedong called that report poison arrow. That report became available only, I think, in 1987. A mysterious package appeared in the office of Tibet Information Network in London. When they opened it, the copy of the Chinese version of 70,000 characters was handed over, and that was translated back in English, and it was published. So clearly, when 98% of monasteries and nunneries were destroyed and 99.9% of monks and nuns were destroyed, so clearly it was a strategy on the part of Communist Party of China to destroy Buddhism, destroy culture of Tibet. Then, after the Cultural Revolution, in the private space, in social space, Tibetans started rebuilding their monasteries, their nunneries. But as far as the government is concerned, the attitude of the Chinese leaders is concerned, and then it was referred to, Ten Kuyan said, we must destroy Tibetan Buddhism from Tibet and make it into a museum piece. We must make sure the new generation, the millennials, don't learn about Buddhism. And also now, they want to, even at the university level, the medium instruction is Chinese language, not Tibetan. High school level, even middle school level, medium of instruction is Chinese. Now, this is a strategy on the part of Chinese government to make sure the Tibetans don't speak Chinese. Tibetans don't speak Tibetan, I'm sorry. They speak Chinese. And it's an ongoing effort on the part of the Chinese government. Now, hence, now what is going on? In their own social space, Tibetans rebuild monastery. This is a very remote place in Serta. 12,000 monks and nuns were there just 14 months ago in Larungar. It was destroyed in broad daylight and reduced to 5,000 monks and nuns. And now this year, the second project is destruction of Yachingar, which has 6,000 nuns. These are remote places, huh? And it's being reduced by a few thousand. What are they trying to do? The three great monasteries of Tibet, Sera, Ganden, and Drepung, in nearby Lhasa, those monasteries used to have anywhere from 4,000 to 7,000 monks. Now, if you go to Lhasa today, if you visit these monasteries, it's reduced to a few hundreds. And many of them are, what we call fake monks, or many of them are under the payroll of the Chinese government. So, pre-Cultural Revolution destruction, during Cultural Revolution destruction, the revival of Cultural Revolution is happening in Tibet even now. Now, that's how the Tibetan culture is destroyed. Now, second way is demographically, with Chinese population transfer to Tibetan areas. So their transfer is subsidized, paid, and encouraged by the Chinese government. If you go to Lhasa today, 80% of shops, restaurants, hotels, the taxi license, the rickshaw license are owned or run by Chinese. Again, it's publicly a practice that if you are Tibetan, they pay you 300 RMB a day. If you are Chinese, they pay you 500 RMB a day. It's the capital city of Tibet. Now, you might think, transferring so many Chinese people to Tibet might not happen, might not succeed. But they have succeeded in Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia used to have Mongolian majority. But now, 80% of population of Inner Mongolia are Chinese. 17% of Inner Mongolia are Mongolians. You can clearly see the demographic shift. Fortunately, because of altitude of Tibet, it's so cold. I know this room is also quite cold today, but Tibet is much colder than this in winter. That's preventing many Chinese from settling there permanently, especially in winter. So what we have is the mountains of Tibet protecting us. And obviously, gods and deities of Tibet are also protecting us here. Now, Diwali is coming. Everybody will light firecrackers, but obviously, most of them are made in China. We have to be careful. Someone asked me this question, you know. Lord Ganesh, that we all pray for wealth. In fact, it's made in China. So money goes to China to begin. When we pray to Lord Ganesh, made in China, I think prayer also goes to China. So Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, if you pray to Saraswati or made in China, I think our knowledge also goes to China. This thing we should be aware of and be careful. Demographically, this is what they're trying as well, with railway line, buses, trucks, subsidies. So hence, the cultural genocide of Tibet is real. And in the social space, in private space, Tibetans are making great efforts to preserve the Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan culture. Now, Jay Ranade also mentioned about securitization of Tibet. This is another thing. Here, I think it's related to India. Because Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders have said, security and stability of China is dependent on security and stability of Tibet. When I heard that line, when I read that line, I thought, okay, it's something to do with the military, the border securitization. No, in fact, it's an internal and external securitization of Tibet. And many of the examples were listed by Jay Ranade. One is, you know, the internal policy is give happiness, take security. This is being implemented. And what's happening is that every community in Tibetan areas, there is a town or a community of 100 families, there used to be one observer, one mole, or one spy, or one party guy, you know, overlooking 100 families. Now they have further broke it down and made it into a 10-family unit. So what he does is that person who's watching over 10 families will give your subsidies if you want license, if you want recommendation, if you want letters. They give you happiness, but you have to give security, meaning you have to spy on your neighbors. So that's systematic. Surveillance cameras everywhere. In fact, I think Wasir, she wrote in her blog that there are more surveillance cameras over Chokhang than windows of Chokhang. There are more guns in Lhasa than the butter lamps that you see in Lhasa. And also, less than 2% of Tibetans are given passports, so they cannot travel outside. So 90+% of Tibetans denied passport. In fact, one Tibetan blogger wrote, it's easier to go to heaven than get a passport from Chinese government. All this control, the securitization, and the Tibetans are issued ID card with second-generation biometric chips in it, which means each time a nomad travels anywhere, you know, swipes his card, his movement or her movement are being monitored. So the securitization is also real. Now, along with it, again, we recently have Doklam incident. So again, this is also a long-term strategy. The Chinese leaders like Mao Zedong, they said in 1950s, Tibet is the palm, they must take over. Then after that, they must take 5 fingers, which are Arunachal, Ladakh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim. Hence, secularization of Tibet will be extended. It's already extended to all the neighboring countries of East China Sea, South China Sea, and Scarborough Island, including Doklam. So hence, securitization of Tibet is also real. So all these things are happening in Tibet now. Now, I thought I should be concluding here because this is what's happening. But I thought I should, you know, give a bit of an optimistic, scenario or some facts so that I could clearly see, because this had me because the title itself is Cultural Genocide in Tibet is a very gloomy title, and the facts, figures, and data have been gloomy, and I can sense a gloomy mood in the audience also. But here, I think Ranade talked about a missionary who said, you know, after many years, he has only four and a half people to show for his efforts, and one being father, mother, son, and the servant, and perhaps the chief of Bathang who said, I'm Christian, but you know, the missionary was not so sure. The resilience of the Tibetan people. Now here I would like to mentioned His Holiness the Dalai Lama after the occupation of Tibet. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, 80,000 Tibetans came to India. So His Holiness had plan A, B, C, D, E, and F. Now I'll all bring it back to India. Huh? Buddhism came from India, I'll all bring it back to India. So the plan A was now 98% of monasteries and nunneries destroyed, 99% again disrobed. So its plan A was to rebuild major monasteries in exile by Tibetans and revive Buddhism in the exile community. So we had only less than 4,000 monks and nuns who survived when he came here. Today, in Tibetan monasteries, we have 42,000 monks and nuns. From these 42,000 monks and nuns, that means we have revived Buddhism in exile among the Tibetan population. Now, that's plan A, so we have succeeded. Plan B, of these 42,000 monks and nuns, 57% are from the Himalayan region and from the west or outside. So plan B was revive Buddhism in the whole of Himalayan belt, from Arunachal to Ladakh to Nepal, Bhutan to Sikkim. Now our interest was, because what His Holiness thought was, exiled Tibetans should take Buddhism back to Tibet after all this destruction. If we cannot do it on our own, the Himalayan brothers and sisters will at least cross over the mountain, because they are across the mountain, right? Cross over the mountain, revive Buddhism back in Tibet. And some people interpret it as, some sinister design on the part of Tibetan people. No, our interest is build Himalayan Buddhism in Himalayan belt so that they can cross over the mountains. If that does not work, plan C was, revive Buddhism in all the Western countries. So we have like more than 1,000 Dharma centers around the world. So the Dharma teachers and their, foreign students, foreigners, right? They will take, European flight or American flight, go to Beijing or Lhasa and revive Buddhism in Tibet. That's our interest. And many of them took flights. They revive Buddhism in Tibet. And also the many lamas from exile have gone back also. Some also from the Himalayan belt also have gone back, right, to help revive Buddhism in Tibet. And the plan D was also hope, not on our own, but partly because of the popularity of His Holiness Dalai Lama, because when you say Dalai Lama, it's Buddhism. When you say Buddhism, it's Dalai Lama. So Buddhism is revived also in China. Now China happens to be the largest Buddhist country in the world, with 300 million Buddhists, or 300 to 400 million. So His Holiness Dalai Lama has seen in his lifetime, Mao Zedong's goal was poison arrow, destroy Buddhism, destroy Tibetan civilization, cultural genocide. But Dalai Lama had plan A, B, C, D, all worked, right? Also in plan E, in Tibet, in private social space, Tibetans are practicing Buddhism. Even though destruction is happening, again it's happening. So hence Dalai Lama succeeded in plan A, B, C, D, E. So I'm sure Mao Zedong in his graveyard, he's rolling in his graveyard thinking, my goodness, I destroyed 98% of monasteries and nunneries in Tibet, 99% of monks and nuns were disrobed. Now look at China. Buddhism, Chinese have also embraced Buddhism. Hence the future of Buddhism is certain. It will be there for a long time to come. Now, His Holiness Dalai Lama's plan F, the final plan, was to revive Nalanda tradition in India. There's no selfish interest, because if you look at the time when there was Nalanda University, Takshashila, from 2nd, 3rd century all the way to 13th century. If you look at the 1,000 years, what was India, where was India? India was #1 in economy, #1 in defense, #1 in civilization. 2-3 Buddhist scholars from Nalanda went to Laos or Cambodia or Thailand, they converted the whole country into Buddhism. Now 14 countries which are Buddhist and 52 countries which have substantial number of Buddhists around the world. So what His Holiness Dalai Lama is saying is, hey, you are India, this is India, Buddhism originated and spread from India, and from 3rd century to 13th century, India was #1 in economy, #1 in civilization, #1 in defense. Don't you want to go back to the 1,000 year where India was #1? Now obviously China wants to be #1. But India has a history of being #1 for 1,000 years. If that's the era you want to go back, then you have to replicate that era. And what is that era? Nalanda University. Nalanda tradition has to revive. Now I know in India, Nalanda University was at least made efforts to revive, right? It's for, I think, more than 10 years now. It's been going on. Still, it's in a makeshift rented place. Now, China started 3 years ago. They have rebuilt a brand new Nalanda University with several hundreds of students. And revival of Nalanda tradition in India, it's a low-hanging fruit. All the Buddhist sites, the sacred sites are in India. So how come China did in 3 years? India mentioned it and made efforts for the last 10 years. Hence his solemnity, again, it's our own interest. If Nalanda tradition is revived in India, we think the survival and livelihood of Buddhism will be certain. So hence his solemnity plan F, the final plan, is to revive Nalanda tradition in India. Hence plan A, B, C, D, E, and F shows the resilience of the Tibetan people. Again, this book starts with introduction of Buddhism in Tibet from India and the destruction. Again, revival back in India, in exile, in Himalayan belt, all over the world, including in China and in Tibet. Now, so if you make efforts to revive Buddhism in India or Nalanda tradition in India, then I think Buddhism survived for 2,500 years before, then Buddhism will survive for another 2,500 years. So as long as there's Buddhism, there's Nalanda tradition, there will be Tibet. As long as there's Tibet, there will be Tibetan people, and then our movement, our identity will survive. So Tibetans, mainly on our own, we rebuilt, we succeed in plan A, B, and C. Even Chinese have helped us. People have helped us, not the government, helped us in reviving Buddhism in China. And Tibetan people on their own in Tibet have also revived Buddhism in Tibet. Now let's all work together and revive Buddhism or Nalanda tradition in India. So that will guarantee the survival of Buddhism, and as long as there's Buddhism, I think we will prevail. Because Buddhism is 2,500 years old, communism is only less than 100 years old in China. So there's no competition between the two. We have won before, and we will prevail again. So with that note, we must remember the cultural genocide is taking place, but Tibetans' resilience have also been demonstrated through our efforts, and we are the third generation of Tibetans who are still standing thanks to the government and people of India. So let me conclude by saying that if you look at the Tibetan leadership, including me and my colleagues who are not here, and all the participants of the audience who are here, almost all of us are born and brought up in India, educated in India. And we also follow the Indian concept of ahimsa. And in fact, if you come to Dharamsala, Tibetan government exile also follow the practice of Indian democracy. Hence, we are the original made in India. So Modi Sarkar wants to talk about, the success of Make in India. We wish the Indian government a grand success for Make in India campaign, but if Make in India has to succeed, then the original Made in India has to succeed. That's the Tibetan freedom struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was, in the end, a fairly rousing call to action. We have had 4 marvelous speakers, actually 5 very good speakers on this panel, and I think they've addressed a series of issues on Tibet, the current situation, the ongoing genocide, the Chinese government's policies, as well, of course, as the weaknesses within China, which should encourage a policy of patience, as Professor Ranshia said. And of course, from the ambassador, very good accounting of the book itself that has just been released. I'm going to open the floor to questions and encourage people to please address many of the issues that were raised here on this panel. Thank you.